May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in His sight, Holy One, you are our rock and refuge. Amen. Stop me if you've heard this one, my music teacher would say. Stop me if you've heard this one, and you'd start to tell a story or a joke or an instructional anecdote that we almost certainly have heard at least a dozen times, maybe 100. There was the story about the time you forgot your music for the concert. There was the example about how parties get louder and louder until you have to shout to be heard. There was the joke about accordions. What's the difference between an onion and an accordion? Nobody cries if you chop up an accordion. Stop me if you've heard this one, he'd say, and sometimes we would actually try to stop him. We were obnoxious teenagers at the time, so we would roll our eyes and shout out punchline before he got there, but on he would go, through the familiar stories and jokes, deaf to our objections, hitting those same familiar points, sometimes in the same exact words, time after time, until we reach the conclusion. Why do people do that? There are, I think, a lot of reasons. Sometimes we are forgetful and we don't realize that we're doing it. Sometimes telling the same tired joke becomes a beloved ritual like this recurring exchange that used to take place in my grandparents' house and now takes place in my parents' and I bring all of my aunts and uncles. Would you like to join me in a glass of wine? One would ask. Do you think they both fit? The other would always reply. Sometimes we tell the same story over and over again because we're trying to make sense of it emotionally. We're learning to live with what we have lived through. Often, trauma survivors will need to retell their story many times as they seek emotional healing. And sometimes we tell those same stories over and over again because they are deeply important to us. Whatever the reason, surely we all know people like that. Sometimes we are people like that, repeating those same beloved stories and jokes to those same indulgent or less indulgent audiences. Today's lesson from Acts at first glance does not seem to have this repetitive quality. Perhaps you're wondering why I'm talking about this at all. But when I studied it this week, I noticed something odd. In the reading that Sarah just read for us, we hear the story of Jesus' disciple, Peter, defending himself to other followers of Jesus. His fellow Jews were asking why he has been breaking Jewish customs by eating with non-Jewish people, presumably eating meals that would have included non-kosher food. And Peter explains his actions by describing a vision he has had while praying in the city of Joppa. He tells them that he saw a vision of a sheet descending from heaven filled with animals, non-kosher animals, which a voice instructed him to eat. When he objected that he had never eaten anything unclean or profane, the voice declared, "What God has made clean you must not call for me." 3 times this exchange repeated, and then the sheet vanished into the heavens. And no sooner had that happened than 3 men appeared at the door inviting Peter to the home of a man named Cornelius, a Gentile. And so Peter went, following the call of the Spirit, believing that the vision he had seen bore much greater import than simply for what we can eat and not eat, freeing him and other followers of Jesus from following customs that separated Jews from Gentiles, and ultimately opening the early church to believers of both Jewish heritage and non-Jewish heritage. We're taught in seminary that when we're studying a text and preparing a sermon, we should make sure to read what's around the text, what comes before it and what comes after it. And so I read what comes before it and what comes after this story of Peter defending himself in Jerusalem to these other believers. Our reading today comes from chapter 11, and in which Peter describes his vision to other members of the early church. But just before our reading, in chapter 10, only a few verses before, the narrator describes Peter receiving the vision. The 2 accounts are equally detailed, and in some places they are almost exactly identical, word for word. Why in the world does the narrator describe Peter's said something like, Peter told them all of the things he had seen, or Peter told them about his vision. It would have been shorter. It would have saved ink and parchment in a time when those things were valuable resources. But the narrator not only shares Peter's words, but emphasizes the repetition by having Peter use almost exactly the same words to describe what had just been described mere lines before. I think perhaps when we hear Peter's story, when we notice that we have already heard this story in these words, that repetition can remind us of something important. It is not enough for Peter to have a private religious experience and let that be the end of it. In fact, it's not even enough for Peter to have a private religious experience that changes the way he thinks and believes and acts, and then keep that to himself. Peter's vision has offered him a glimpse into a new thing that God is doing. God is throwing the doors open wide, breaking down barriers that have contained the good news within one specific community, sending Jesus' followers out to build a community that transcends social categories, in this case the social categories of Jew and Gentile. It is not enough for Peter to simply begin to eat with Gentiles. He is called also to tell the story of the new thing that God is doing, to invite other followers of Jesus to join him in this new chapter of the unfolding story of God's love. This is perhaps the most striking example of a story being repeated in the book of Acts. The telling and the retelling occur only a few verses apart. They're close to word for word. But there are other stories as well that we encounter 2 or 3 times or more in this book. The Apostle Paul's conversion story is told in Acts 9, but he retells his own story twice. First in chapter 22 to a crowd in Jerusalem, and then again in chapter 26 to King Agrippa. Furthermore, the book of Acts is crowded with speeches, sort of sermons, in which the apostles tell the story over and over again of what has happened with Jesus Christ. It is not enough for them to know the good news. It is not enough for us, the readers, to know that they know the good news. Again and again, the narrator shows us the disciples sharing and telling others about God doing new things, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul's call to conversion, Paul, who was formerly a persecutor of the early church, the vision which leads Peter to start spreading the good news to Gentiles as well as Jews, stories of God doing new things. To us who know these stories, it can sound a bit like a broken record. Peter begins to describe his vision, and we say, wait, I've already heard this. But Peter's speech reminds us that there are others who have not heard this story. Peter's speech reminds us of the vital importance of continuing to share the story of God's unimaginably vast love with people who have not heard this good news, even if we sometimes feel like a broken record, repeating the same old thing over and over again. A few nights ago, Bishop Gene Robinson was the interview guest on the Comedy Central show The Colbert Report. Bishop Robinson was the first openly gay bishop ordained in the Episcopalian Church, and he has been a strong and faithful voice for civil rights for LGBT people, and as well for the full inclusion of LGBT folks in the life of the church. He was promoting his new book, God Believes in Love, Straight Talk About Gay Marriage. And gotten it wrong, he said. God loves each of us just as we were created, he said. Loving relationships, no matter the genders of the partners, are a blessing to be cherished and exploited, he said. I'd heard it all before. I'd said it all before. I listened to Bishop Robinson speaking passionately and faithfully and honestly about what he believes God is doing in our time and place, in our contemporary church. And as I listened, I remembered this week's text from Acts, the same story, same words, told to new people because they hadn't heard it yet. And I realized that every single time Bishop Robinson says those same words, proclaims that same good news, tells that same story of God whose love is big enough for all of us, someone out in the world hears it for the first time. Someone is sitting in front of their television or listening to their radio or clicking around on the internet who has only ever heard of a God of closed doors, a God of insiders and outsiders. Someone who for the first time is invited to worship a God who is bigger than they had ever imagined. Do you think in our story from Acts today that was the last time Peter told the story of the vision he received that opened the church to people like me, like you? No. I imagine he told that story many, many more times as he continued to do God's work for the world. Does Bishop Robinson get tired of repeating those same talking points, making those same arguments? Maybe he does. I know sometimes I do. I might be a young pastor, but I remember having these conversations as young as 8 years old, and sometimes these days I feel like a broken record. Perhaps it's the same for you. This church has for decades been on the forefront of issue after issue trying to lead the wider church toward more justice, more inclusion, more light, more love. And sometimes perhaps we feel like we're just repeating ourselves. But today's lesson reminds us that even if the story we are telling is so familiar to us that we can tell it in our sleep, we are called to witness to the good news of God's love. Because out there in the world, friends, there's a lot of bad news. There is bad news of hatred and violence. There is bad news of oppression and injustice. There is bad news of a God of insiders and outsiders, whose love is rationed out to those who think correctly and believe correctly and love correctly. There is a lot of bad news out there, and there are many, many people who are thirsty for good news. Good news of love and compassion. Good news of grace and mercy. Good news of inclusion and welcome. We are called to proclaim that good news, whether we are proclaiming it for the first time or the 1,000th. And when we do that, friends, when we tell that same story over and over, we are not merely broken records, mechanically repeating the same old song. We are bearers of a sacred story. A story of God's love for all creation, made known in Jesus Christ. A story which never changes, but is always growing, overflowing every barrier, breaking down every door,